Paradise Lost. When I had lost my first country, and when in my second country and in my place of refuge, and in my third country, and in my second place of refuge, I had lost everything. Then I set out to look for a land that was not poisoned by any memories of irreplaceable loss. So I came to paradise. There I found peace. Everything was whole and good. I lacked for nothing. Then a sentry with a flaming sword said, "Get lost. You have no business here."
Ich möchte Ihnen, Erich Fried, sehr danken für Ihr Werk und ich weiß um die Bedeutung der Lyrik für diejenigen, die eine ehrliche Politik machen wollen.
2 years ago in Vienna, the former Chancellor of Austria, Bruno Kreisky, celebrated the 65th birthday of his exiled countryman, the poet Erich Fried. Fried, who is Jewish, is the best-selling contemporary poet in Austria and Germany, where he has won almost every literary and humanitarian award. But he's chosen not to live in Austria since 1938, when his family was destroyed by the Nazis.
Has anyone seen this?
What's that?
It's about the Nazi hunter who...
The new paper.
Yeah.
The new
I haven't
paper.
seen that.
The new paper, it looks ghastly.
Now he has a British family and a home in North London, where he has lived since he fled from Vienna.
Well, unfortunately I'm against capital punishment. Otherwise I would be for Maxwell and Murdoch to be burned at the stake at Wapping.
Although he's been settled here for half a century, he still writes exclusively in German, a language that is alien to most of his family.
Well, I still have...
Some of his poems have been translated into English, but Fried's overriding concern is to address the people who share his language.
I am an Austrian. That was my formative country, and that's my mother tongue. And I wouldn't permit Hitler to get me away from that. When I came to England to the Jewish Refugee Committee and was asked about my intentions for the future profession, I said, I want to become a German poet. And they hit the ceiling and said, young man, the sooner you get rid of these craven thoughts, the better it'll be for you. Bekenntnis zu Wien. Ob dem, der keine Heimat hat, ein Liebeslied gelingt, auf seiner Kindheit Vaterstadt, beladen und beschwingt. Weil du mit keinem Trunk mich labst, trink ich zu dir mir Mut. Dass du mir doch das Leben gabst, mein Wien, ist gut. Du hast mich aufgezogen, Stadt, dann stießest du mich aus. Nur wer schon Eis im Herzen hat, hockt, wo es brennt, im Haus. Drum, als du 38 schriebst, in Schande und in Wut, dass du mich aus den Grenzen triebst, mein Wien, ist gut. Weil ich nun in der Fremde wohn, verschwimmst du oft in mir, und manchmal braucht es Mühe schon, dass ich dich nicht verliere. Du meine Freude und mein Weh, du Angst und bange Mut, dass ich dich einmal wiederseh, mein Wien, ist gut. If you come home after a few years, particularly if these were the years of Hitler and the war, you find that your acquaintances and friends have died in the war, your own people have been murdered as fast as they couldn't get out. The entire milieu from which you come, also the intellectual milieu, has died out, has changed beyond recognition. You find a few people from the olden days like their own ghosts. even if there's a schoolfellow who survived, I know it's not his fault, but there's this strangeness. Why did he survive?
This city of ghosts had once been one of the most vital cultural centres in Europe. Until the beginning of fascism in the 1930s, the cafes and salons of Vienna had drawn like a magnet writers, artists, musicians and scientists from all over the continent. Bartók and Schoenberg, Einstein, Freud, Egon Schiele and Arthur Schnitzler. Vienna became a melting pot for new ideas. Erich Fried was born here to middle-class Jewish parents in May 1921.
Sehr deutsche Frage an einen deutsch schreibenden Dichter. Weshalb schreiben Sie? Weil Sie wollen oder weil Sie müssen?
Ich glaube, weil ich muss. Autobiografisch erforscht hatte ich eine leichte Bewegungsstörung als Kind. Mein Vater sagte dann freundlich, dass er weiß nicht, wie er zu seinem Kind kommt und ich bin nicht lebensfähig. Und da habe ich kompensiert. Und hatte auch zufällig das Schicksal, dass ich mit 5,5 Jahren so ein Wunderkind wurde und auf die Bühne kam und dadurch mit ganz vielen literarischen Texten konfrontiert wurde. Und das war ungeheuer anregend. Und so habe ich mit 6 Jahren ungefähr, 5,5 Jahren, 6 Jahren, angefangen, die ersten Gedichte zu schreiben, worunter dann auch, weil in Österreich ich eine furchtbare politische Sache erlebt habe, das Massaker vom blutigen Freitag, Juli 1927, da habe ich die Toten und Verwundeten vorbeitragen gesehen. Daher war mein zweites Gedicht auch ein politisches Gedicht. I dreamt the other day of happy life, of peaceful work, discussion without strife. No war would be, no hatred against others, and we should love each other like good brothers. And all should eat, none have to go without. Suddenly I awoke. A shot rang out.
It was the acquittal of a group of Nazis accused of murdering several workers that began the confrontation. The Palace of Justice was set on fire during the street battle, in which 86 workers and 1 policeman were killed. Posters went up in the streets, accusing the chief of police of the massacre.
I knew the president of police, Dr. Schober, was responsible for the massacre. And so when at Christmas time I was supposed to recite a poem in the festival hall of our and 2 other schools together, a Christmas poem, and I heard Dr. Schober was amongst the guests. I used my best child prodigy manners from the stage and stepped forward, said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid I can't recite my poem because I've just heard Dr. Schober is amongst the guests, and I was on Bloody Friday, that was the name which was given to the day of that massacre in Vienna, in town, and I saw the stretchers with dead and wounded, and I can't recite a Christmas poem in front of Dr. Schober." Ben sort of took another bow and withdrew, and then Dr. Schober jumped up and left the hall with his followers and banged the door. He thought, of course, it had been prearranged, but my teacher knew it wasn't prearranged and came and said, "Erich, how did you come to think of that? That was wonderful, it's magnificent," because he was against the police, of course, the teacher. And my father was furious with me, and that confirmed me even in thinking that I had done the right thing, because I adored my teacher and was very critical of my father. My father said, the boy is swimming in the wake of communism, and I didn't know what communism was, I didn't know what wake was. I looked it up in the encyclopedia, and so these were my first factual informations about political movements, communism, and then it says see Marx, and so I looked up Marx and so on. It was an encyclopedia from the turn of the century. on the way to my old school. In this street, where loudly they threatened years before they came, just you wait. I did not wait. In this street, the past silently threatens, years after its passing, just you wait. And here I am, waiting.
During Fried's school days in the late 20s and early 30s, the political atmosphere in Vienna grew steadily grimmer. Civil war in 1934 led to the overthrow of democracy and an inevitable growth in anti-Semitism. For several years, Fried and other Jewish boys sat alongside Hitler Youth in the classroom and even became friends with them.
It's a funny feeling to come into a classroom in my old school. First thing is to see a picture of Waldheim, the federal president. I think it's not necessary. The second thing that struck me is the crucifix on the wall. We didn't have that when I came to school because nearly half the school were not Christians. There were many Jewish people. Now I suppose the Jewish people have either emigrated or been killed. There are not very many left. So it is certainly not meant offensive to anyone. If you have been taunted because of belonging to a minority from childhood on, that does things to you. I've been brought up to be more skeptical. I've been brought up not to recognize sacred cows. I mean, love of one's collective, of one's language, of the people who have the same fate of one is very important. Also of one's nation, if that nation happens to be suppressed.
On March the 12th, 1938, German troops crossed the Austrian border. By the end of the month, over 70,000 people had been arrested, mainly of Jewish descent. Within 3 weeks, 90% of the population had voted yes to Hitler.
I was Jewish, and that meant that I would be persecuted and I would eventually be killed, I felt sure, if I didn't leave the country, by the Hitler people. I knew that a war was to come. Everybody who knew Hitler from inside his territory knew that there would be war. And I knew that in such a war all Jews would be killed somehow. I didn't dream of gas chambers, of course, but I knew they would be killed somehow. On the 24th of April, my parents were arrested. They were not political, but they had tried to get some money for relatives of my mother's best friend out of the country. And they had no clue how to do that. They sat together in the coffee house, 30 of them, to discuss it, and the waiter overheard them and denounced them, and a lot of them was arrested. Then the house was searched, and we had to move from one room to another. And the man took all our books, the man who searched us, and opened them to see whether some money was hidden in it or something, and then dropped them to the floor openly. And then the man grumbled and said to my father, "Why do you have so many books? If my wife brought in so many books, I would throw her and the books out of the window." And my father looked at him and said, "Yes, I can imagine that very well." And the man was not sure whether that was a compliment to his male courage or a taunt at him, but he decided it was a compliment. And desperate though I was, I had great difficulty not to burst out laughing. This was the last joke I ever heard from my father. When he came home exactly a month later, he was dying. The floor, the part of the house, the staircase where I'd met him by accident when he was just brought up, was pretty dark. And I didn't even recognize him at first.
Why did he die?
Well, because he said to the Nazis, I'm the only one who knows the connection and you won't get anything out of me. And that, of course, was practically suicide. The man from the SS, from the Gestapo, from Germany, Herr Göttler, trampled on his stomach, and his stomach was lacerated, it seems it was burst. And then they let him lie for a few days until he was in agony practically. And they released him then, but he died the same day. Am Judenfriedhof ist viel Land umbrochen und Sarg um Sarg kommt und die Sonne scheint. Der Pfleger sagt, so geht es schon seit Wochen. Ein Kind hascht Falter und ein Alter weint. Dumpf fällt der Vater in die Erde. Ich werfe Lehm nach, feucht und kalt. Der Kantor singt, es wiehern schwarze Pferde. Es riecht nach Sommeraufenthalt, die mir die Gärten meiner Stadt versagen, die Bank im staubigen Grün am Quai. Sie haben mir den Vater totgeschlagen, dass ich ins Freie komme und Frühling sehe. It's nearly 50 years since I have been here. I was only here once for my father's funeral on the 27th of May 1938. And at the time, this place wasn't quiet as now, but full of activity. One grave after the other was being dug, and one coffin after the other, and one lot of mourners after the other came, because so many Jews had been killed and so many had committed suicide. And it was very different. I didn't know that my mother, it must have been my mother, erected this gravestone or tombstone, a small one. Still, I didn't know it existed.
Before she was arrested by the Nazis and sent to prison, Fried's mother had hidden some money. Fried used it to hire a lawyer who got him the documents necessary for his escape. On August the 4th, 1938, he boarded the train out of Vienna, bound for London.
Leaving home, I was very sad about it, and my future in England seemed most uncertain, and I left my grandmother behind and my mother in jail. I felt pretty sure I would get a visa for my mother. It wasn't so easy to get a visa for an old person without having money, because England wasn't that magnanimous as a rule. And I didn't get a visa for her in the end.
His grandmother was deported to Theresienstadt and from there taken to Auschwitz, where she was killed in a gas chamber. Alongside his father's grave in the Jewish cemetery are memorials to others who didn't escape. The inscriptions say deported or murdered. Fried's urgent priority when he got to England was finding a way to rescue more Austrians. Near his lodgings in Maida Vale, he came across rows of derelict houses.
I went into these houses and stole lead piping, which I sold to an old metal shop in Maida Vale. For 10 shillings, I got poor Irish families to give signatures that they wanted to employ married couples. And that meant that 2 people could get a visa. All in all, I got out 73 people.
After difficult negotiations, he also managed to get his mother out. She arrived in England 2 days before the war. Fried became a milk chemist, a button maker and a fire watcher, and he wrote for a poetry magazine put together by refugees.
Questions. How big is your life? How deep? What does it cost you? How long do you have to pay? How many doors has it? How often have you begun a new one? Were you once made to run for it? If so, did you run round in a circle, or did you run to and fro? And what did you think to yourself? How did you know that you had come full circle? Did you run more than once? Was the third time like the second? Would you rather drive that distance by car, or be driven? In what direction? By whom? Catherine has objected sometimes to me bringing too many things into the house. It is probably because I was utterly impoverished and lost all my things when I came to England in 1938. And then, of course, one starts surrounding oneself with a few objects. This is a very well-known phenomenon. English prisoners of war have refused to attempt to escape because they had collected a few old tins out of which they had made cans and jugs and so on. I partly surrounded myself with objects which I liked as ramparts against despair and a feeling of annihilation. Catherine claimed that I knew the contents of every rubbish bin for a mile around. Look, chair.
Do you think you'll be able to manage to put it together?
Yes.
Oh, I don't know. Okay.
No, yes. Where will we put it?
Well, not in my room, anyway.
Not in your room.
Let it be broken.
Okay. The world becomes, in a way, a more interesting place. The more things you can put together. Thinking and also creative thinking, which leads to poetic ideas, is always the making of connections, and also not taking things for granted, but looking at them as if one looked at them for the first time, but not entirely without knowledge. For example, this American Indian headdress here hides actually the urn with the ashes of my mother. I thought that scattering the ashes in the garden of memory is too easy a way to get rid of one's dead. On the other hand, there is an irony in it, because my mother was very possessive and never let go of me. So now it seems I'm not able to let go of her. I think, in a way, the most important objects I have in this room are here. This is a knife from Auschwitz. I found it in Birkenau on a meadow where the people had to undress before they went into the gas chambers. And somebody evidently had brought the knife up to there, but hid it in the grass. When I found it, there were still bits of rotting wood on the sides. I was firmly resolved not to bring any souvenirs from there, but I bought several souvenirs. The other thing was a woman who led us round, who had been a camp inmate, gave to each of us a bit of sand which she picked up from the ground, and said, "Look what the stuff is on which you're walking." And when we looked at it, we found that there were bone splinters in the sand. And I had been walking about for some time already and was quite numb. And I must have put it in the pocket of my plastic raincoat. And when I went away in the car from there, I noticed that I was crying, so I groped for a handkerchief and put my hand in the pocket of my plastic raincoat and took it out white, because what I had thought was sand was ashes that had dried through the warmth of my body. Questions about poetry since Auschwitz. Whether it rose up as a small brown bird out of the smoke of cremation ovens, and then rested in one of the birch trees of Birkenau, whether it flew closer, drawn by the screams of the girls and saw them raped, and then sank to the dust of the ruined cities its song of quiet love, and to the starving the lay of the ripening corn, whether it grew up in the shadow of money and lent it its voice, for money had grown too big to be able to jingle, whether it flew through the world and learned its sense of beauty from the vivid colors of bodies torn to pieces, from the bright flames of village huts, or from the glint of the changing daylight in glazed eyes, whether at last, in a tree stripped by defoliants, it built its nest of hair, of paper shreds, rags, and bloody feathers, and now waits for mating, for the time to sit on its eggs, and for the hatching of its eternally innocent young, that only lyric poets know, who steadfastly called for wild bird protection in a world soon to be whole again. There was a far-flung theory amongst intellectuals that one can't write poetry about Auschwitz and such ghastly things because it wouldn't be adequate. That theory is basically stupid because it assumes that you could still write an adequate poem about the death of one man or one child, and that's also not possible. Our task is not to write adequate poetry. It is hubris to think that one can make adequate or perfect poetry, but poetry that is as good as we can make it, as stirring, as thought-provoking and feeling-provoking as we can make it. And that one can write even after Auschwitz and even about Auschwitz, and it is necessary to do so, because if you stop writing about things that really are great, then you only end up with piffles.
Do you think that the European response to Auschwitz, to the death camps, to the Holocaust, has been sufficient?
No, it couldn't be sufficient. Also, the only very nearly sufficient way would be to develop a system of society which doesn't in itself produce again and again anti-democratic and fascist forces, and not a man of the extreme left, but a very moderate man, but a very good sociologist, namely Horkheimer, has said one can't speak about National Socialism without speaking about capitalism and imperialism. And as long as you have production for profit and not for social necessity, the world will always again be reduced to a shambles, and the big takeover bits will always see to it that power gets concentrated in fewer and fewer hands.
In 1951, Fried joined the BBC German service and made weekly broadcasts to East Germany. It was because of his deep commitment to communism that he felt impelled to speak out against the mistakes he saw being made there.
Heute muss ich leider wieder einen Fall erörtern, diesmal in Leipzig, in dem sich die Behörden keineswegs wie gute Sozialisten verhalten haben. Bevor ich heute über zwei Angelegenheiten... I wanted to go back after the war, either to Vienna or to Germany, anyway to something within the German language, and help to rebuild there what had been destroyed culturally by the Nazis. And I didn't do so because I'd found enough in the Stalin era which I couldn't stomach. I didn't want to fight against communists because I knew their own problems and heart searchings which were similar to mine. So I was a bit desperate. I stayed here.
This family portrait was painted by the artist and photographer Catherine Boswell, whom Fried married in 1965. Although at first a happy family life helped him to settle into comfortable exile in Kilburn, he couldn't cut himself off from German poetry and politics. He soon became involved with a group of German poets that included Heinrich Böll.
I got to know Heinrich Böll gradually better and better because we both belonged to the Gruppe 47. The Group 47 was a group of German writers who were united by the aim that what happened under Hitler must in no way be repeated, and the mentality that led to National Socialism should be changed, and that also as writers we must try to use our influence both in our works and as citizens protesting against bad laws and so on. Engaged poem. I remember my anger and my search for the right words for my anger, and the last revision before the final copy, and reading it aloud, and in the end my satisfaction, which rid me of my anger. So I can afford to forget how I fumbled in vain for the white sheets of paper, and how I was afraid, because my fingers get clumsier, and because the carbon for the final copy kept falling, and I felt giddy when I picked it up.
Fried's commitment to the fight against fascism took an unpredictable turn with the publication in 1960 of a semi-fictional book, A Soldier and a Girl. It's the story of a love affair between a Jewish soldier at the war crime tribunals and his prisoner, a young Nazi wardress who has worked at Belsen. On the eve of her execution, she asks him to sleep with her. He does. The story is partly based on the trial of this woman, Irma Grazer.
I knew that she had committed Nazi crimes, but she was hanged when she was 22, and not only am I against capital punishment, but I was also of the opinion that people who had been entirely a victim of Nazi education could not possibly, by the age of 22, be supposed to have had time for enough independent thinking to know what they were doing when they fulfilled commands.
The book had a major impact on a new generation of Germans. Gerhard Wilke was a young student living in Britain in the mid-60s. He knew Fried first through his poetry and is now a family friend.
Hello. Hi there. Here's your lunch.
Like many other young Germans, Wilke had found it impossible to come to terms with the war, with the role his parents' generation had played in it. It was this book, written by a Jew, which helped him and others like him to resolve such conflicts.
It began the process of opening up, of looking at our parents, not just as monsters who wouldn't talk to us and who were vilified by the teachers who were now teaching us the new gospel of democracy and what the Allies had brought, really. But it opens, a book like that then opened a way of actually looking at them as human beings.
The anger felt by the youth of post-war Germany was reflected in the upsurge of student protest in the late 60s. especially in the demonstrations against the Vietnam War. Fried's poems about Vietnam identified their problems and offered a historical perspective for their indignation.
Einleuchtend. Es kann nicht sein, dass die Amerikaner ohne Notwendigkeit vietnamesische Kinder verbrennen. Es kann nicht sein, dass die Amerikaner Marshal Key unterstützen, wenn er wirklich ein Schurke ist. Sie unterstützen ihn wirklich. Er kann also nicht so schlimm sein. Und was er sagt, kann nicht so unrichtig sein. Er sagt wirklich, sein Vorbild ist Adolf Hitler. Also kann es gar nicht so schlecht sein, wenn man Hitler zum Vorbild nimmt. Doch auch Hitler hat Kinder verbrannt, und nicht in Vietnam, sondern näher. Warum also regt man sich auf, wenn die Amerikaner das tun?
The Observer's correspondent in Germany at the time was Neil Asherson.
The real impact of Fried's poems in the middle and late 60s about Vietnam, particularly at least in Berlin, which is all I can talk about, is that they're widely circulated, they were read with great excitement and great emotion. And yet this was before the main student mobilization had begun. It was already going on in the States to some extent, but not in Germany and not in Berlin. It was just beginning. I think the importance is something one can say very briefly. He made a connection between the crimes of fascism and the crimes of the Americans in Vietnam. And this connection was absolutely crucial in creating that student movement as it later developed and giving it its particular flavor, its particular internationalism. It was saying, if we want to fight fascism today, where do we fight it? Where is it? It's there. And Fried made this connection, almost the first explicitly to make it.
The non-violent student movement was crushed by the increasingly oppressive tactics of the German police. A smaller, more fanatical group who did believe in violence emerged, the Baader-Meinhof group. Fried became notoriously involved with them.
Actually, I've been accused of being a sympathizer of the terrorists. I am a sympathizer, just like Heinrich Böll was, to the extent that we both utterly disapproved of their tactics, but tried to understand the reasons how they came to be terrorists.
Fried's association with the Baader-Meinhof group was a central issue in a recent program on German television. He was asked about a poem he'd written, which had been condemned as murder poetry.
Als zum Beispiel zu meinem Entsetzen der Generalbundesanwalt Buback vom Baader-Meinhof-Mitgliedern, denn offenbar waren es Baader-Meinhof-Mitglieder, erschossen wurde auf der Straße. Da habe ich ein Gedicht darüber gemacht. Und in diesem Gedicht hieß es, was soll ich sagen von einem toten Menschen, der auf der Straße lag, zerfetzt von Schüssen, den ich nicht kannte und nur wenig zu kennen glaubte, außer einigen seiner Taten und einigen seiner Worte. Und dann schrieb ich weiter, dieses Stück Fleisch war einmal ein Kind und spielte. Dieses Stück Fleisch war einmal ein Vater voll Liebe. Dieses Stück Fleisch glaubte Recht zu tun und tat Unrecht. Dieses Stück Fleisch war ein Mensch. Von all diesen Zeilen wurde nur eine in der Presse zitiert, dass ich den toten Buback genannt habe, dieses Stück Fleisch, und ihn damit noch im Tod zu verhöhnen suchte. Eine solche Lüge durch ein Zitieren, das aus dem Zusammenhang gerissen ist, kann natürlich jede Äußerung in ihr Gegenteil verkehren.
There were other incidents. In 1974, Fried had to defend himself in a German court. He'd accused a policeman of murder after the death of a student demonstrator. Fried was acquitted when Heinrich Böll gave evidence as a character witness, saying, "It is the duty of a writer and journalist like Fried to clarify the issues, to fight official oppression, and occasionally to antagonize people."
It's a very different kind of role a poet and a writer has in the German context than in Britain, really. I mean, here you can admire Disraeli for also having been quite a decent novelist, but you wouldn't really take the political opinions of Ted Hughes or Larkin very seriously, really, because in people's heads there are separate worlds. I mean, you have the division between art and science and the humanities and politics and art, really, and fiction and faction, and I think all those boundaries don't really exist in the same way in the German tradition, really. I mean, we have through the difficult birth of the German nation and the unification, really, the poets really became the focal point very often of bearing, as it were, the unhappy consciousness or conscience of the nation, really, keeping it alive and holding it up to people, really. So, and through that long tradition of people like Hölderlin, Heine, Brecht, and I would call, Fried in that as well, really, the poets actually are not just poets, they're also political spokespeople that are taken seriously in their own right.
When I first was called a Saujud, a sow of a Jew, a pig of a Jew, Jewish pig, I said, yes, of course I'm a Jew, and I'm proud of being one, which is an understandable reaction. Our school teacher, however, whom I loved, when Jewish boys behaved badly, he said, don't do that at school, you can do that at synagogue. And when Christian boys behaved badly, he said, don't do that at school, you can do that in church, because he happened to be rather anti-clerical. And so, anti-religious even. And so I realized that to say I'm proud of being a Jew, in a way, is stupid, because it's not an achievement and not a shame, it's just fate. You've been born that way. And consequently, I decided that one mustn't fall for chauvinism or nationalist prejudice or group prejudices, even if one is persecuted, but that obviously one has to fight against persecution and be solidaric with others who are persecuted. Hear, O Israel, when we were the persecuted, I was one of you. How can I remain one when you become the persecutors? Your longing was to become like the other nations who murdered you. Now you have become like them. You have outlived those who were cruel to you. Does their cruelty live on in you now? You ordered the defeated, take off your boots. Like the scapegoat, you drove them into the wilderness, into the great mosque of death, whose sandals are of sand. But they did not take upon them the sin you wished to lay on them. The imprint of their naked feet in the desert sand outlasts the traces of your bombs and your tanks.
Presumably you believe that it is right for the Jews to have a homeland.
Oh dear, it would have been right if they hadn't tried to drive out the inhabitants of that homeland. And I don't think the Jews have a right to a state that is racist. A Jewish homeland, a place where they could settle, would have been a different thing. And the Palestinians didn't object to that originally. But once it became a state, it means to establish a state against its former inhabitants. Their original slogan was a land without people for a people without land. And to think that Palestine, at the eastern end of the Mediterranean, with Jerusalem as a capital, would be a land without people except a few nomadic Arabs who could just as well live next door, was an idiotic assumption. I felt, as a Jew, I had to stand up for the Palestinians because they were driven away from their country like I had been driven away from Austria.
During the late 60s, Fried's attitudes became increasingly provocative. Not only did he, a Jew, criticize Israel, but he felt increasingly that the BBC was using his programs to perpetuate Cold War attitudes. On January the 25th, 1968, he gave his final broadcast.
Heute sage ich Ade zu all denen, die mir hier im Laufe der letzten 17 Jahre zugehört haben. Es ist nicht ganz leicht. Ich kann nur hoffen, dass Sie auch in Zukunft lesen oder hören oder auf der Bühne etwas sehen werden, was ich geschrieben habe.
Fried has in fact spent much of the last 30 years going back and forth across the Berlin Wall, antagonizing the authorities in the West, and then trying, with his poetry, to encourage more liberal policies in the East. The concept of Glasnost hasn't been accepted here in East Germany, but there is an audience eager to listen to Fried.
Brief nach Moskau für Michail Gorbatschow. Nach 60 Jahren Zuversicht, Zweifel, Enttäuschung, in denen die Ohren sich nicht vor der Lüge im Namen der Wahrheit verschließen konnten, die Augen nicht vor dem Unrecht, kann ich jetzt doch noch zwischen mein Alter und meinen Tod
Guten Abend, Erich Fried.
diesen neuen Lichtblick stellen, der alles verändert. Diese von Nachricht zu Nachricht deutlicher werdende Hoffnung, dass unsere Kinder glücklicher leben könnten, weil endlich Wahrheit aufsteht aus verkümmerten Halbwahrheiten und dasteht in Menschengestalt und will Menschliches bringen und wagt es, zum Sollen das Dürfen zu fügen, zur Frage die offene Auskunft und rückt der Freiheit wieder den Stuhl an den Tisch. Dies Besingen, von tiefen Narben gezeichnet, kann die alte Lust an Liedern für große Genossen noch keine Worte finden, die unbeschädigt genug und gut genug wären für das Aufatmen und die Freude.
Ich glaube, dass vielleicht bestimmte Gedichte, politische Gedichte, hier anders aufgenommen werden. Gedichte, die sich mehr zur linken Problematik beziehen. Da ist vielleicht hier ein größeres Bedürfnis, diese Sachen ausgesprochen zu bekommen, als das vielleicht in der Bundesrepublik oder in anderen westlichen Staaten ist. Aber ich glaube, das Interessante an ihm, was übergreifend wichtig ist, ist das eines sehr scharfen Kritikers und dennoch eines Vermittlers zwischen Fronten. Und ich glaube, dass das der wichtigere Punkt ist für beide Systeme.
Das erklärt sicher auch die Nähe, in der sich Fried zu Gorbatschow empfindet. Dass es trotz aller Klarheit einfach um eine Toleranz geht, die entwickelt werden muss, dass Leben möglich bleibt auf dieser Erde.
Who is responsible for the war, for the division of Germany, for these bricks and these stupidities either side, these repressions, these divisions, barbed wire and mines? Well, there's one person. Hitler is responsible. This is Hitler's sort of victory, really. And that's why he goes across. Maybe that's the biggest reason of all, because he's still fighting old fascism, fascism now, what fascism left behind it, which is Europe as we see it, unfortunately, and the fascism which he fears might one day return.
Krank. Wer gegen die Gesetze dieser Gesellschaft nie verstoßen hat und nie verstößt und nie verstoßen will, der ist krank. Und wer sich noch immer nicht krank fühlt an dieser Zeit, in der wir leben müssen, der ist krank. Wer kein Mitleid hat mit denen, die er missachten und bekämpfen muss, um gesund zu sein, der ist krank. Wer in unserer Welt, in der alles nach Rettung schreit, keinen einzigen Weg sieht zu retten, der ist krank.
In 1985, Fried's doctor in West Berlin diagnosed the cancer that has recently reappeared and for which he is taking regular chemotherapy.
But anyway, now I don't want to die, and it's not so much that I'm afraid of dying than that the things I do in life, from writing poetry to political developments to making love, are all very important to me. And I think that particularly in politics, the thing that one was able to live after all the disappointments one had, to see what Gorbachev is doing in the Soviet Union, and that actually Trotsky appears again on pictures next to Lenin, and that freedom is to be brought into things. And I feel I'm very happy that I am not only living to see that, but by my writing to help that tendency and to bring into discomfort the enemies of that tendency, of which there's no lack. And I think this is very, very good. But at night, when I wake up and lie in the dark, I'm scared. And I either have to put on the light and write down my thoughts why I'm scared and what exactly scares me pinpointed, then I'm much less scared, or I can write a poem about it.
Fried has written more than 40 volumes of poetry, fiction and autobiography. A recent edition of love poems has sold 200,000 copies. He is also Germany's foremost translator of Shakespeare. So far he has translated 26 of the plays. He's brought poets like Dylan Thomas, E.E. Cummings and Sylvia Plath to a new generation of readers.
I think that what exile gave Fried, particularly specifically British exile, was a kind of edge, a kind of detachment, a combination of kindness and sardonic, dry wit, which is rather un-German. I mean, he's a committed poet, but he's also a detached poet. He's deeply committed to the changes in the world, Germany, and all the rest of it that he wants. At the same time, he doesn't, like German intellectuals tend, he doesn't get thrust into the sand of this debate and head, shoulders and everything till he can't see, hear or experience anything else at all. He's always a little outside, a little aloof in the way that he writes.
If you live in another language, with people of another language, you get, as it were, an additional dimension, because the people in another civilization are articulating their thoughts and feelings in a slightly different way than in your country of origin, because they have different cultural and psychological and philosophical traditions. And that helps. Also, the poetry of two different languages is rarely in the same phase of development, and that also helps. When I was in Vienna as a child, a window to me was, as a matter of course, a window consisting of an inner and outer window which could be opened in the middle. When I came to England, I saw that windows could be very different.
Well, if you opened your eyes, it would be easier to do them. That's better.
Well, shall I open them or shut them?
Keep them open, Erich, because this one is the one that I'm going to do when you fall asleep, which I haven't really properly started yet. But this one, you're supposed to be actually awake. But you say eyes are so difficult to make. They are, but in this one, you've got to have your eyes open because you're going to fall asleep anyway while I'm doing it. You fall asleep anyway. Drop of a hat. Now you look like Blake's death mask when you've got your eyes shut.
I look like Blake's death mask anyway a bit.
Well, I can remember when you were ill, when you had that ulcer, and I came in the morning.
Retrospect. I wanted to be the flame of my time, or part of its flame. I was its shadow, or part of its shadow. My time was the time of fury, shadow of fury. My time was the time of helplessness, shadow of helplessness. The time of tyranny, shadow of tyranny. I wanted to be the banner of my time or a shred of its banner. Banner of flame, of fury, of helplessness, of tyranny, or its shreds, or part of its shadow.
In 1987, Fried was awarded the prestigious Büchner Prize in Germany. During the ceremony, the mayor of Darmstadt implied that Fried shouldn't have accepted the prize, as he was so critical of the government. Fried walked out with a group of supporters, but the mayor tried to persuade him to go back.
Ich sagte, ich möchte gern zurückkommen, aber Sie müssten sich für die Sache, dass ich den Preis nicht annehmen dürfte, und für die Doppelmoral entschuldigen, denn sonst kann ich nicht zurückkommen.
Gut, also ich bin bereit, um den Abend nicht auf diese Art und Weise zu...
Aber ausreden lassen. Ausreden lassen, man muss jeden Menschen ausreden lassen.
Entschuldigt, es ist so, ich bin Mitglied dieser Akademie. Ich trete sofort aus dieser Akademie aus. Es ist staatlich subventioniert, wenn diese Subvention irgendeine Verpflichtung für Wohlverhalten impliziert.
Überhaupt nicht. Überhaupt nicht. Das habe ich auch nicht gesagt. Nein.
Entweder hat die Akademie den Preis und kann den Preis vergeben, oder man wird an den Staat...
Deswegen bin ich weggegangen, aber man muss Herrn Metzger jetzt ausreden lassen.
Ich bitte doch sehr darum.
Man muss Herrn Metzger, der ganz andere Meinung ist als ich, nichtsdestotrotz ausreden lassen. Das geht doch nicht. Er hat sich hierher begeben in eine Gruppe von Menschen hier, die überwiegend nicht seiner Meinung sind. Und da muss man ihn ausreden lassen. Okay.
Also es tut mir leid, dass ich Sie mit diesen beiden Sätzen beleidigt habe. Und ich nehme die...
Sie nehmen sie zurück?
Ja, ich komme doch gar nicht...
Oh, okay.
Ich kann doch gar nicht ausreden hier. Das ist also etwas Merkwürdiges, dass man da um etwas gebeten wird, wenn man ansetzt, dass man dann nicht die Chance bekommt. Ich nehme die beiden Sätze zurück.
Okay.
Gebt euch die Hand.
Okay. On ice. I've striven to be understood and tried to speak so that what I talk about and my reasons for speaking and my purpose should be clearly heard by those to whom I spoke. But what did they make of it? I remember a joke in which a child who came late to school blamed the black ice on the roads. For each step forward, he said he had slipped 2 steps back. Not so unlike my own case. Then how did you get here at all? Asked the teacher. That's easy. I gave up and just tried to go back home. Not so unlike my own case now. I will try not to strive anymore to be understood, only to get back to myself, to the place where I was at home and which now isn't there anymore. The joke about the ice made me laugh as a schoolboy. That I still remember clearly.